Good afternoon to all our listeners, all our participants from various parts of the world. And it may even be evening in your part of the world or very early in the morning. We are really welcome you to the 25th anniversary of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And this afternoon, we really have an exciting program for you. But let me begin by just telling you a little bit about how we opened this 25th anniversary. The theme for this year's 25th anniversary program of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series is The Movement for Decolonization Continues. And when we opened the lecture series last week, we pointed out that why are we talking about decolonization? We said truthfully, because it is an unfinished project, locally and globally. And we said that if we paid attention to what is happening globally and what's happening in our own region and elsewhere, we would find that there's a continuing struggle for physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual decolonization everywhere in the world, whether that is from Gaza to New Caledonia or from Myanmar to Haiti. We also recalled that Kwame Ture, for whom this lecture series is named, his words continue to ring true. We said that, interestingly, 1 year after Kwame Ture called for Black Power, he did so in Mississippi, if you remember. He attended a conference in London, and in that conference, he identified imperialism as the main threat to human rights, social justice, and racial equality. And it's in keeping within that context that we are talking today to this amazing young woman, Rania Khalek, and I hope I pronounced her name correctly. If I didn't, she'll correct me. She's a Lebanese-American writer. She's a political activist, a journalist at Breakthrough News. Her work has appeared at Common Dreams, Salon, The Nation, In These Times, Citizen Radio, and more. Her work can also be found on her website called Dispatches from the Underclass. So it is really my pleasure to move very quickly into bringing our keynote speaker for today's Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series, Miss Rania Khalek, and she's going to talk with us today. We call it Conversations with Rania, because what we're dealing with today is Palestine. What does decolonization have to do with it? What exactly are we talking about? So I introduce Rania.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's quite an honor to be speaking at such a lovely conference, especially named after such an important person like Kwame Ture. And it's a pretty big idea what you're talking about, the idea of decolonization. Now, just to reiterate what you said, I am Rania Khalek. Well done on getting the name right. And I'm a journalist with Breakthrough News, which, for those who don't know, is an independent leftist American media outlet where I host a show called Dispatches, where I cover things from an anti-imperialist perspective. And I'm really lucky to get to have on really brilliant guests who teach me a lot about imperialism in the world. And we've been covering Palestine almost on my show almost exclusively since October 7th, since this horrific genocide began. And I should also add that I'm speaking to you from Beirut, Lebanon, where I live, and where every day we hear Israeli threats of genocide directed at Lebanon. The Israelis say they plan to take Lebanon back to the Stone Age, that they want to copy and paste Gaza onto Lebanon, that they want to invade and ethnically cleanse and colonize southern Lebanon and make it, part of Israel, part of their greater Israel project. The Israelis haven't been able to do that because Lebanon has a very strong resistance. At the forefront of that is a group called Hezbollah, which has repeatedly defeated Israel, you could say, decolonized parts of Lebanon, liberated Lebanese land, and it continues to defend Lebanon's borders, which is why the U.S. labels it a terrorist group. And I assume, probably everybody watching recognizes the dangers that U.S. imperialism and, of course, by proxy, Israel pose. U.S. imperialism is the biggest threat to humanity, and Israel is a crucial tool for U.S. imperialism. Now, I'm not an academic, so I can't speak as really an expert on decolonization the way an academic might be able to. But as a journalist of Lebanese descent who lives in Lebanon and has interviewed many experts on this issue, I can say that Zionism, the ideology at Israel's foundation, is a European settler colonial movement that was implanted in this region in the Middle East to control resources and geopolitics to the benefit of the imperialist West. And that's why the West is willing to sacrifice its so-called rules-based order to protect this vassal state, Israel. And Gaza, we should recognize what they've done there is how far the West is willing to go to protect their hegemony. None of us are safe in this US-led imperialist order. It's a system led by greed and hate, and we're all killable in their hierarchy of humanity, especially those of us in the global South, but really just anybody who opposes it. Now, this genocide in Gaza, and I want to emphasize it as a genocide because the mainstream media refuses to call it that. They call it the Hamas-Israel war. And that's all meant as a distraction from the horrors being committed against the 2.3 million people in what has become the Gaza death camp. And I just want to explain a few things about what people in Gaza are dealing with right now that many of you are probably aware of. But it's unbelievable what we're witnessing. It's really unparalleled in my lifetime and maybe perhaps in history at this point, just because of the high-tech nature of this genocide. But what Israel has carried out in Gaza with the full backing of the imperialist West has caused psychological injuries so severe that children as young as 5 years old say they would prefer to die. I mean, that's just astounding. Children as young as 5. There is something in Gaza called Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. That's become an acronym, WCNSF. That's never been used before, but it's so common in Gaza for there to be a wounded child with no surviving family. It's now a term that doctors use regularly in Gaza. We know at least 40,000 people have been killed. I mean, that number is much likely very high, like much higher than that. It's sort of been stuck at 40,000 because the authorities in Gaza have lost the ability to really count the dead anymore. There's more than 80,000 wounded in Gaza, and these aren't just, scrapes and cuts. These are severe wounds. Gaza now has the highest rate of child amputations anywhere in the world. There's over 7,000 people missing in Gaza. Those numbers I just gave, that's 5% of Gaza's 2.3 million population. This is unprecedented. And again, we don't know the actual numbers. 370,000 housing units have been destroyed in Gaza. We haven't seen anything like that since 1945, since the Second World War, according to the UN. And we know over 15,000 children have been killed. The number, again, is likely much higher. And this is all intentional. Israel is intentionally starving the people of Gaza. They're saying so out loud. And it's said it will take 80 years to rebuild Gaza. I could go on and on and on listing off numbers. I just want to emphasize how severe this all is. And this is all happening amidst nonstop bombing, summary executions of civilians, of doctors, of patients in hospitals. Every single hospital in Gaza destroyed, again, intentionally. Schools, refugee camps, tent camps at this point are being destroyed with 2,000-pound US supplied bunker buster bombs by the Israelis. So why? Why all this destruction? For what? We know that Israel wants to take as much Palestinian land with as few Palestinians on it as possible because it's a colonizing entity. But what about the West? What do they get out of it? This moment of hyper-imperialism, of imperialism on steroids, it seeks to destroy and punish anyone who refuses to submit to the current order. And the imperialists are willing to carry out a genocide as punishment, as they're doing in Gaza. They want to stop us from building a better and liberated world. What Western governments have called Israel's right to self-defense translates into an 8-month-long murder spree of Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians and overwhelmingly children. For that, we should categorically deny the genocidal apartheid state of Israel the right to self-defense, if that's what their self-defense means. That right belongs solely to the occupied people of Palestine. But of course, again, I'm speaking to an audience who probably understands that. But there's a couple more points I want to say about this. Israeli society, as many of us have seen, is openly celebrating its crimes. They're proudly posting their genocide to social media. We're witnessing nothing short of a live-streamed Holocaust against the Palestinians of Gaza, all supported by the imperialist West. And the Israelis have been so empowered and emboldened because there are no red lines. They literally openly celebrate it and they say it out loud. And the egomaniacal and callous behavior of Israeli society, I want to point out, is not an aberration. It's a reflection of what the West truly stands for, of what all these settler colonies across the West truly stand for. We're watching in real time also the media and global North political leaders cover it up and gaslight us. Again, they call it a war on Hamas. They say the victims who are being starved, bombed, and annihilated are responsible and that Israel has no choice. Even as Israel's leaders, again, tell us they're committing a genocide. Can you imagine them reporting about the Holocaust or slavery in the way they report about Palestine, where everything is centered around the security of the oppressor, the colonizer, the slave master, the Nazis? And as Israel's genocide in Gaza reaches new heights of cruelty, from killing premature babies to executing patients at hospitals to bombing tent encampments full of refugees displaced 5 times over. I want to go back to the question of why. Many are wondering why Western regimes who claim to be the leaders of the free and civilized and lawful world are enthusiastically supporting the belligerent annihilation of Gaza. It almost seems like they've gone crazy, right? They're willing to destroy the order they worked so hard to create, all to protect Israel. They're willing to provoke regional war with Iran and even nuclear war, potentially, for this settler state. What do they gain? Well, we know that Israel is their weapon in the Middle East and even beyond, as Israel has participated in U.S. dirty wars around the global South, doing some of the U.S.'s dirty work. And also, I want to point out we shouldn't fall for the lie that Israel and its lobby or some sort of Jewish lobby are running U.S. policy. The Israel lobby is just an arm of the military-industrial complex that helps reinforce U.S. imperialism in the region. Like Biden said, if there weren't an Israel, America would have to create an Israel. That's why they arm Israel to destroy Gaza, to bomb Lebanon, to kill Iranian nuclear scientists, to arm fascists in Latin America, to mow down international law, all to secure interests, American interests, in the region and around the world. And we know that global North leaders are racist, right? They don't see Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, the jungle people of the global South, in the words of Joseph Borrell. They don't see them as human. But I think the most important factor in what October 7th meant to the Western imperialist project. What Palestinians did in the El Aqsa flood operation on October 7th struck fear into the hearts of Western leaders. Palestinians broke out of their cage. It was like a slave revolt. And as history has shown, no slave revolt goes unpunished. Joe Biden and Ursula von der Leyen, they don't take kindly to indigenous people in the so-called jungle shooting at their precious garden. And Israel is one of their gardens. The West is backing the Gaza onslaught as part of a genocidal drive against the oppressed people of the global South. They're sending a message that this is what happens if you dare strike back militarily against their rotten, colonial, capitalist, hyper-imperialist system. Israel versus Gaza is a microcosm of the global North versus the global South. The imperialists have created a world where a small group of ruling elites led by the US very effectively steal from the global South to maintain their hoarded wealth. If this system collapses, they lose everything. They're desperate to prevent that. This system has destroyed so much for hundreds of years and has made a lot of people very rich. And its maintenance requires a constant evolution in control and domination. And this system will not tolerate any resistance to it. That's why they sanction over a third of the world. It's why they overthrow governments and invade and collapse misbehaving countries. That's why they kill babies and destroy hospitals and create famine. They literally shorten lifespans as a matter of policy. This system is so parasitic, they're willing to destroy the world if it means preventing the collapse of imperialism. Again, Gaza is a microcosm of how far they're willing to go. Not just Gaza. I mean, you don't have to look any further than the willingness to risk nuclear war with Russia and China to see how psychopathic they are in their ambitions. But back to Gaza, let's not forget that in addition to being a concentration camp, which has now been turned into a death camp, Gaza is also a laboratory where Israel and its Western backers can test the most brutal yet sophisticated methods of domination and control on those marked as unpeople. The people of Gaza were marked for death a long time ago. They were put on a diet, in the words of the Israelis, and placed under siege and subjected to carpet bombing campaigns every few years, which they call mowing the lawn, each one worse than the last. Those methods of domination and control have then been exported around the world to be used on other marginalized populations to uphold the imperialist order. That's why the Israelis have this booming weapons industry. They literally market their weapons as battle tested and combat proven. They're proven, they're combat proven on occupied people in Palestine. We need to consider this context as we watch Gaza face annihilation, because we're entering into an era of climate disaster and a crisis of capitalism combined with this gradual decline in US empire, the most violent empire in history, which is terrified of the rise of China and a more assertive Russia. Let's not forget, by the way, since I mentioned China, that China is still their primary adversary. I mean, even in the Middle East, China's existence has been very important to Middle East resistance. Middle East resistance at this scale wouldn't be possible without China as this economic counterweight to the US. The resistance axis in the Middle East that receives funding and arms from Iran is possible because of China. Because China refuses to abide by US sanctions on Iran, it has allowed the Iranian economy to access goods and capital it otherwise couldn't due to US sanctions. The same goes for Russia. And a similar dynamic plays out around the world. China's existence in this way makes it harder for the US to strangle countries that don't behave. And the US knows this. That's not to say that China or Russia deserve all the credit or anything for resistance on the ground in the Middle East, just that this moment in history allows for an effective military resistance to imperialism in the Middle East, the likes of which this region has never had. And in an increasingly multipolar world, October 7th triggered the West's worst anxieties. A bunch of brown people in the global South shot at their plantation owners, and they worry there could be more of this. So they aren't only practicing high-tech methods for obliterating a population, they're setting a new precedent. In the near future wars of imperialism, it will be hard to match up to the horrors of Gaza. And as long as it's not Gaza bad, it might be tolerated. They're expanding the goalposts of their barbarity. Even now, we're all seeing Gaza and saying, well, wow, it's so much worse than what the US did in Iraq. It makes Iraq seem somehow tolerable by comparison. We have to resist that conditioning. We should also be aware of internal repression in global North countries. This is a mask-off moment for the imperialist West. All of that sociopathic narcissism that underpins the dystopian global order they created is on display for everyone to see, including their own populations. They've made a mockery of international humanitarian law and killed any pretense of the freedom and democracy they claim to represent, as they turn inward to repress their own populations from dissenting against the shocking aggression on Gaza. The overwhelming majority of citizens across the global North support a ceasefire. That's what polls show. Yet this isn't reflected at all in global North leadership. Professors are being fired, students are being suspended and tear gassed and beaten by police who've been sent in like armies to put down the protests. They've been arrested. They've had their futures put on hold in some cases. The anti-democratic nature of this rotten system has been laid bare for all of them to see. And the more people in the global North who stand against this barbaric settler colony and the US's support for it, the more that happens, the more repression tactics will be used to suppress popular opinion and displays of protests. This is where the left is crucial as an organizing and radicalizing force. This moment presents a huge opportunity. That's why the campus protests over the last few months in the US have been so important. It's also worth noting that these protests are happening at elite universities that are supposed to be producing empire's future leaders, which is one of the reasons it's such a thorn in the side of America's administrators. I also want to talk about the resistance on the ground in the Middle East, not just in Gaza, but that's obviously at the forefront is the resistance in Gaza. But you also have a country like Yemen, which is the poorest country in the region that just survived its own genocide that was led by the US and Saudi Arabia. While the rich Gulf monarchies normalize with Israel and humiliatingly do nothing for Gaza, the poorest country in the region has been blocking ships in the Red Sea, exacting material consequences to pressure the US, Israel, and the UK to stop the genocide on Gaza. And they're getting bombed and sanctioned and designated as terrorists for it. But they don't care because this is a moral duty for them to resist imperialism. In Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, popular political and military formations are standing up to Israel and the US in solidarity with the resistance in Gaza. And they face similar consequences, but they do it anyway because they understand that liberation means sacrifice. It always has. Many countries know this as well. I mean, countries like South Africa and Nicaragua are aware of this. And that's why they're two countries who've been leading the legal resistance against Israel, taking the case to the ICJ against both Israel and Germany. And then you have a country like Iran that's been under sanction and constant attempts at regime change by the US. Iran fired 300 missiles at Israel in recent months in response to Israel bombing its embassy in Syria. 300 missiles. Israel needed a week of preparation in 4 countries to help it shoot those missiles down. This was a huge change in the equation of the region. It shows that forces and countries in the region aren't scared of Israel anymore. And I want to add that we should never be pushed into a corner to condemn these acts of resistance. We shouldn't, because that's always a way for the imperialists to get us to capitulate to their framing. In fact, these movements and countries actually have a right to resist. They have a right to self-defense more than a settler colony like Israel does, certainly more than the US, a country on the other side of the world, does. I don't want to sit here and ignore the loss, though. I don't want to sit here and act like, this is something to celebrate, because the loss in Gaza is huge. It is devastating. It shatters the heart. It crushes the soul. But we can never lose hope. In Gaza, every single day, there is a resistance that fights the Israelis and exacts casualties under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Someday, PhDs will be written about the bravery and courage of the people in Gaza who built tunnels to survive an extermination campaign. These people, they understand, like I said, that liberation means sacrifice. Look at Algeria. Look at South Africa. Look at Haiti, at Cuba. Look at China. Look at the Soviet Union. In all these cases, liberation meant a great deal of loss and sacrifice. We can't lose sight of what these people are fighting for, of what we on the left are fighting for, and our role in the fight for liberation wherever we are in the world. We cannot let these babies in Gaza die in vain. We cannot return to the status quo. There are no bounds to the West's depravity. There never has been. They're risking regional war, like I said, because this is an existential threat to Israel. Israel is the tip of their imperial spear in the region. And Israel literally can't win. They can destroy. They can kill lots of civilians. They're clearly excel at killing children, but they can't militarily win. October 7th was such a big deal that they need a genocide to erase it, but they can't. Even if they kill 100,000 people in Gaza, which they actually might, they can't defeat the Palestinian will to resist their annihilation and liberate their land. And they want us to believe that opposing this genocide is actually some form of anti-Semitism. There's nothing anti-Semitic about it. There's nothing anti-Semitic about opposing genocide. And the imperialists, they don't care about Jews. They never have. They're using Judaism as a shield for imperialism. What's more anti-Semitic than that? As an Arab, I reject the notion that the answer to the crimes of European fascism, of the European committed Holocaust, is they get to create some ethno-religious fascist apartheid state in the Middle East. Enough of this. There's no more letting Europe displace blame for their Holocaust, a Holocaust that Europe committed, onto brown people who had nothing to do with it. They say we need to be civilized, but it's the Western world that needs civilizing because their barbarism is a threat to our security, to the security and sustainability of humanity. And I can't give this whole presentation without mentioning the issue of sanctions because it's absolutely related to what we're witnessing right now. This is America's primary method of neocolonial warfare at the moment, sanctions. This unilateral economic warfare from the US, it impacts over 1/3 of the world. From the comfort of their air-conditioned offices in Washington, D.C., the same bureaucrats and executives in their expensive suits who are signing off on the genocide in Gaza, they also craft these starvation sanctions that impoverish citizens of non-compliant countries. In Syria, which is right next door to me, this has meant the country can't rebuild after years of a civil war, which the U.S. and its local allies armed and funded a collection of al-Qaeda-affiliated Salafi jihadist groups to carry out an attempted regime change war. Where these people were, of course, celebrated in the mainstream media as freedom fighters and moderate rebels, but they were just, another version of a dirty war of fascist gangs meant to overthrow the Syrian government and collapse the state. This is a country that prior to 2011, it was self-sufficient in food and medicine production, that had one of the best medical systems in the region. And now it's totally dependent on outside aid, and the majority of its population is food insecure because of the war and because of sanctions. In Iran, sanctions have meant crushing the middle class and denying people access to medicines for rare diseases and cancers. In Venezuela, it's meant hyperinflation that destroys livelihoods and creates shortages of everything. In Cuba, it's meant shortages of food, medicine, fuel, and during COVID, syringes. The government officials enforcing these policies know that they're killing people, but they think it's worth it. That's what Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said in a 60 Minutes interview in the 1990s when asked if the sanctions on Iraq had led to the death of 500,000 children. And when asked if that was worth it, she said, yes, it was worth it because that's what we needed to do to get rid of Saddam. Despite occasional admissions about the true nature of sanctions, mainstream Western media wants us to believe that fuel and medicine shortages in these countries are the result of corruption rather than economic sabotage from the most powerful country in the world. I guess corruption only exists in U.S. adversary countries. The people planning and enforcing this cruelty would start a war if they had to endure no electricity in the scorching heat, or no internet to live stream, or no fuel to drive their cars as a result of policies of an adversary country. This isn't a consequence of mismanagement or corruption, as U.S. mainstream media would have you believe, which is, of course, a problem in every country to different degrees, particularly under the decaying neoliberal order that we're living under. It's a consequence of deliberate economic and infrastructure sabotage from bombing campaigns and sanctions that are meant to cause shortages and suffering and excess death. It's the Cuba model. It's the Gaza model being imposed on any country that dares to pursue a path independent of U.S. dictates. And many of the countries in this region in the Middle East who are subjected to these sanctions happen to also be countries that are crucial to supporting the Palestinian resistance. And this is where the battle of ideas becomes crucial. As a journalist, I don't believe in objectivity. The purpose of my work is to expose the cruelty and parasitic nature of our global imperialist system led by U.S. empire. Whereas everyone here is aware, a tiny handful of elites, through their monopoly over capital, control the world's wealth. In order to do that, they have to maintain U.S. military dominance and economic hegemony over the world. And that means controlling the narrative. In order to maintain this system of uneven distribution that leaves so much of the world impoverished, so if you can live in luxury, it's crucial to secure hegemony over information, the information people consume, especially in the imperial core, in the midst of neoliberal decay that's led to growing inequality in even the most developed countries. But their hegemony is increasingly being challenged. by several countries and movements who refuse to submit to that global imperial order. Here, I mean Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, China, and the Palestinians. The media plays a major role in this by demonizing any country that doesn't play the role assigned to them by US imperialism. And much of this media is controlled by oligarchs. We're living in an era when the 8 wealthiest people in the world have more wealth than the bottom half of humanity. That's more than 4.6 billion people. And many of these individuals own some of the biggest media outlets, so they can help shape the narrative that people are fed, which is important for them because they need to spread a narrative that justifies such an outrageously unequal system. In the US, just 5 corporations, just 5, own 90% of the country's media. That means 5 companies control the overwhelming majority of what Americans watch, read, and listen to. And because they have a stake in maintaining this international imperial order that benefits them so much, they promote the State Department narrative about the rest of the world. And they're very successful in shaping American opinion most of the time. They effectively convince the American public that up is down, that resistance is terrorism, terrorism is resistance. We see this playing out in the way the corporate media is covering up and justifying Israel's genocide in Gaza. But they're still losing because of Palestinians on the ground reporting their reality, and because of Israelis on TikTok reporting their crimes, and because of the rise of independent media outlets like the one I work for, Breakthrough News. That's why they have to censor and fire and suspend people. That's why they have to lie about Hamas and create a mass rape hoax or talk about 40 beheaded babies that never were. As the truth becomes impossible to cover up, they're going to get increasingly desperate. Israel is becoming desperate because it's becoming a pariah state. 8 months into Israel's genocide in Gaza, Israel supporters are getting so desperate that they're just, defending their live-streamed mass murder of tens of thousands of civilians, that they're trotting out all of their favorite propaganda points, everything from claiming European roots to the Middle East, to accusing even Israel's softest critics of anti-Semitism, while the West pulls out all the stops to protect its satellite settler colony. With Zionism exposed to much of the world for the genocidal savagery its victims always knew defined it, it's becoming clear this project is not only unsustainable, but maybe nearing its end. And in some ways, I would even say Gaza is liberating the world, not just Palestine, because it's exposing the true face of Western imperialism. It's demonstrating that the anti-colonial struggle is crucial to the liberation of us all. Still, we know the West, even with its waning power, is well organized, well resourced, and ideologically in sync. So the question becomes, can the global South and its allies in the West confront this moment? We know the hyper-imperialist West is the greatest danger to humanity, and what happens in Palestine will not stay there. The horrors we're witnessing are a lens into what they have planned for the future. So we need to get organized, because it really is socialism versus barbarism. So we mourn the martyrs and fight for the liberation of the living. And that's how we free Palestine and hopefully free the world. Thank you so much, you guys.
Well, thank you very much, Rania. What an interesting and exciting presentation that was. I had a number of questions lined up and you've almost answered all of them in your presentation. Very, very interesting and exciting. I like that closing remark there, because it brings me back to what the young people in Soweto had said during their battle. Their battle cry was, "Don't mourn, mobilize." So even though we feel the pain that occurs, we recognize that continuous mobilization and education, as Kwame Ture would have said, is essential. We just have to keep educating, keep mobilizing. Thank you very, very much. There were also some gems that you highlighted there. I loved it when you said that the Palestinians are reporting on their genocide and Israel is reporting on their crimes. I mean, we are, journalism has really taken a new, the technology allows for such an interesting moment in the way we are able to understand and see what is happening on the ground from both sides. I thought that was very interesting. Another interesting gem, I think you reminded us that slave revolts do not go unpunished. And it's interesting because at the start of this Kwame Ture lecture series, our sister, Dr. Jemima Pear, made the same point when she spoke about the situation in Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
She said that that is one of the reasons why we are in the situation we are in now. So, very interesting points that you shared with us there, and there have been questions coming from the floor. So before I hit you with some of my own questions, I won't be the moderator that starts with my own questions, although I had some burning ones, and we'll save those a little bit. I'm going to take some of the questions that have come from the floor first. And in doing so, I'm just going to remind everyone that we are really in a very tight time situation, because Rania is in Lebanon and their electricity closes off exactly at midnight, and she's just a little ways away from midnight. So we're going to try to
Sanctions.
get as many questions from the floor as possible, and so that you get a chance to respond to them. One comes from our good Dr. Fergus. And he says he notes that some analysts have been predicting that Lebanon is next on Israel's gun sights. And you're there now, and he's worried. So how is Lebanon prepared to defend itself against an Israeli invasion? And is it something that the Lebanese feel that it's impending? How are they thinking this through?
So that's a really important point. And obviously that's been a huge news item, because there has, since October 8th, been this kind of starting out as low level, but it's become a bit more serious, back and forth between the Israelis and Hezbollah. And Hezbollah basically began shooting at Israel after October 7th, in solidarity with Hamas and other Palestinian resistance groups in Gaza. And so there's been this tit for tat between Hezbollah and Israel that has kind of stayed isolated to certain areas of both the north of Israel and south of Lebanon, within about 15 kilometers of each border of the border. Every so often, the bombings on both sides do go outside of that zone, but for the most part, it's stayed within those rules of engagement. But it has been ongoing for now 8 months. Several hundred people have been killed on the Lebanese side, including direct attacks on civilians and journalists, but as well as military figures here. And then, of course, Hezbollah has been hitting almost exclusively, Israeli military targets, which shows you quite a difference between how the two sides fight. But that said, Israel has refrained from a full-on invasion or mass bombing campaign in Lebanon for a couple of reasons. One, they are bogged down in Gaza. You can only fight so many fronts at the same time, no matter how powerful of an army you are, especially when it comes to a country like Lebanon, where Israel's not in its own territory. Not to say Gaza is its territory, but Israel controls Gaza. It knows where everything is in Gaza, except for perhaps the tunnels. And it used to occupy it. It knows the lay of the land quite well. And Gaza's surrounded on all sides. It's a very small territory. It's surrounded by air, land, and sea. All the crossings are controlled by Israel or Egypt, which honestly is just Israel by proxy. And there's not very much strategic depth to Gaza as a result, whereas Lebanon is a whole country and has a lot of strategic depth, and that is Hezbollah's area. It's its towns, it's its territory. So it's not easy for Israel to invade Lebanon. And the reason we know this is because they tried to in 2006, and failed miserably, and were essentially defeated by Hezbollah after a 33-day war and forced to retreat. It is now, 15 years later, Hezbollah has gotten much more powerful. It's had experience fighting in a war in Syria, where it's done a lot of offensive maneuvers. It's a much bigger, more powerful, and better armed organization than it was in 2006. So this has acted as a deterrent for the Israelis. They can talk, there's a lot of bluster when it comes to the way the Israelis talk about Lebanon, and they absolutely can completely obliterate and destroy Lebanon with superior air power. There's no question. However, they would be dealing with essentially what's an army that is capable of carrying out a great deal of damage and destruction to Israel, the likes of which it's never seen before. It's capable of overwhelming Israel's air defenses and capable of hitting, Israel, it could literally put out Israel's electricity infrastructure, for example, something Israel's never had to deal with. People would literally be living in bomb shelters in Israel all the time if an all-out war with Hezbollah were to take place. So that is what so far has prevented an all-out war. That said, there are elements in the Israeli government that do want a war in Lebanon. They've so far been restrained by some cooler heads in the Israeli government who are aware of the consequences for Israel of what a war like that would look like, but also the Americans. This is one of, so far, the Americans kind of like red lines, and not because the Americans care about Lebanon or like love Hezbollah. They obviously don't. It's because the Americans don't believe the Israelis are capable of winning, and they feel very strongly that this would draw them into a war that would end up provoking a war with Iran, which the Americans do not want because of the fact that that would put American interests in severe danger across the region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very, very much for that that discussion and that response to that question from the floor, as I like to say. I have one that I'd like to share with you, and this is has to do with the international law. You mentioned that, in fact, the West seems to be willing to just dismantle the entire international law, the order that has been built up over all these years, in some instances led by them, in order to continue this, to prosecute this horrendous genocide in Gaza. So my question is, what do you think is the likely consequences of the recent judgments of the International Court of Justice and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the charges led by Prosecutor Karim on the war and on global politics, not just on the war, but on global politics? Do you see any consequences there? How do you feel about that process?
I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm not entirely sure I'm the most qualified to answer that in a very specific way. But what I will say is this. I think that the material consequences of the outcome of these rulings, if they're in favor of Palestine, which they have been so far, won't result in anything because the U.S. controls the global order, and they will prevent anyone from being arrested. As we've seen, they're willing to sanction the ICC if they dare to try to arrest Netanyahu or put out an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. So I think, though, what's important, even if there aren't actual material consequences because the U.S. can block them, I think that this is going to further isolate the Israelis and the Americans and demonstrate that they're basically rogue states that people should see as quite dangerous, but also you can't take anything they say ever again seriously. And that's what's going to end up harming the U.S. in the long run, is that they can't run around saying what they say about China and Russia anymore, using these institutions as they have in the past, because it doesn't matter. You basically have just completely made them irrelevant, because in the most horrific genocide we've seen right now, in front of our eyes, you are preventing these institutions from doing anything about it. So I think that's where the importance of these rulings comes in. But I mean, them alone aren't going to change anything. And I also want to point out, which is something I should have said in my presentation, I guess, when I talk about the rules-based international order that the U.S. has created, the U.S. is dismantling the sort of mask of that international order, which is their claim to support human rights, which we know they never have, but it's just so blatant. But I think we should start looking at what Israel's doing in Gaza as the rules-based order. That actually is the rules-based order. The rules-based order is we, the imperialist countries and our proxies, can do whatever we want to whoever we want, and they must submit, where you have to play by our rules. That's the rules-based order. The genocide in Gaza is the rules-based order.
Mm. That's such a disturbing truth that we will have to come to terms with. We talked about the students. You mentioned the student uprising and the sort of the backlash, which is that there seems to be a lot of repression now against professors who have come out speaking about the state of Palestine and the historic information about Palestine, which they are now sharing. And I think it's such a high price that Palestine has had to pay so that the rest of us in the world could understand what settler colonialism looks like. To me, the price has just been It is so unending and so high. But as you mentioned, there is some unmasking taking place now of the kind of when you hear of the kind of repression against professors who have dared to come out and speak, and people, and even what do you call these presidents of universities, these elite universities, who some dare say have not done enough to squelch the student uprising. Seems to be, we are really on the cusp of some dangerous times. I don't know how you're viewing this.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way you put that, as like Palestine has to undergo so much suffering for us to see settler colonialism. I think it's so interesting because isn't it crazy that in 2024 there's even settler colonialism? Like, it's just nuts. It's nuts. It's just wild. It's like it's kind of like we're getting a lens into the past in many ways. And I think that's what's so powerful about the Palestinian issue, is that anybody who comes from any oppressed group anywhere can find some thread that relates to what their people have been through, because it's just everything all at once live streamed in your face, which is something we've never seen. I mean, even when we read about, the genocide of the Americas, or what happened across Latin America or the Caribbean, and this, the slavery, the slave trade, and then also slave revolts. Like, these are things that we read about, but we don't see video footage of it. And it's so hard to, we read about the racism and the hate that needed to be like indoctrinated into people and inculcated into them in order for them to agree to such a heinous system being carried out, so a bunch of rich people could make money, a bunch of rich Europeans could make money. But what's happening in Israel Palestine is so scary, because we're actually seeing how that was able to happen. Like, watching the hate and it's not even just racism. It's like a celebration of killing babies. That's what we see the Israelis doing. We're watching a society so consumed by hate and like a desire to just steal land, and just like this ideology just blinds them, that now it's like, oh, now I understand how all these other things happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago. It really, like, now I'm like, okay, I understand how apartheid South Africa happened. Like, I get it, because we're seeing some sort of like twisted version of it play out in something that's happening before our eyes. And I know that's a bit off topic from what you were raising, but I just wanted to point that out. I think for a lot of people, it's so shocking, because we're like, oh my God, the brutality of these things we've only ever read about was so bad.
Yeah,
so
I think people that image of people grabbing food boxes off those trucks, throwing them onto the ground, stomping on them, crushing them. And then recently we saw an image where there were members of the military, the Israeli military, setting fire to cartridges of water that were about to be delivered, so that they would just melt, and the plastic containers would melt, and all the water would be destroyed. And then you see the on the other side, people dying for a sip of clean water, children drinking water from mud holes, and so on. And you really have to tell yourself, the contradiction, the image of this is beyond us in a sense, but it does give us an understanding of what settler colonialism and racism and social injustice and so on, what it looks like. I want to share some of the other comments from people on the floor before we take any more questions. So one of our colleagues is saying he's pleased to see the level of student awareness and activism in US campuses, but he's wondering, have they been able to get beyond just are you familiar enough to be able to answer for us if you think those students are getting beyond just Gaza, or are they understanding the other imperialist adventures that the West is engaged in, whether it's happening in the Congo, or whether it's in Venezuela or Guyana or Haiti? Do you think they are able to make those kind of links? One of our colleagues asking from the floor.
So that's a really, really important point. And actually, I did get to spend some time at a few of the campuses. I got to go to UCLA before it was horrifically and violently dismantled by a bunch of fascists and the police, though I guess those are both the same thing. So sorry about that. Um, I got to go to George Washington University and see that. I got to see some of the stuff happening with people involved in Colombia after they were also violently thrown out. And so all that's to say, I did in those circumstances see like not everybody's having that conversation, but definitely it's the idea of this is a problem of imperialism. This is obviously Gaza's at the center of it right now because there's a genocide happening there and we're here to stop our universities from funding it. But this is absolutely connected to what the US does across Latin America, across Africa, across Asia. And this has definitely been a gateway for people, at least from what I observed, to learn about wars they'd never learned about before, like the Korean War, for example. Or maybe they didn't know that much about the Vietnam War, or even more recently, the Iraq War. And also, Haiti was brought up because, the US has been trying to get Kenya to help invade Haiti. And again, so that was brought up too. People have been talking about the Congo, the attempts at a regime change in Venezuela, and also connecting the fact that, Hugo Chavez was such a big supporter of Palestine, and so is the current Venezuelan government under Maduro. And what's that about? So this has definitely been a spark for conversations about the broader understanding of imperialism. And I think that's super positive. And I also think, I just want to add to that there are groups who've been organizing around Palestine for more than a decade now. And I've been covering that stuff, for a decade now, and sort of watching it evolve. And I have to say, I am incredibly impressed with the ideological consistency that we see when it comes to certain groups, especially like one of the biggest groups in the US right now is Palestine Youth Movement, PYM. They've been doing so much work on Gaza, but they also have a really solid understanding of imperialism around the world and, what Israel means to the US and how this plays out in other parts of the global South. So yes, I am incredibly hopeful and inspired by the awareness and activism around imperialism that we're seeing really flourish because of the activism against the genocide in Gaza.
Okay, thank you again. No, there's just one more before, because I don't want you to get cut off before I raise this question. And before, of course, we thank you a million times for joining us this afternoon. And there's all sorts of comments coming from the floor as well. But I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to ask you this one. As someone who's close to the struggle, what is your view? Are we going to see an end to the genocide? Or are these new talks of ceasefire agreements just talk to satisfy domestic political agendas? The pain is severe for those of us who have to watch this. What's your take on it?
So I can't predict the future. I wish I could. That would be an awesome power to have. All I can do is say what I think might happen or how I think things will go. And I don't like to make super declarative statements on this because I could be very wrong. I do think the genocide will end. I don't think we're just going to live in a perpetual genocide. It absolutely will end because there is too much resistance to it. And there are too many potentials for a bigger explosion of war outside of Gaza that a lot of people don't want. That said, I think that the atrocities in Gaza are going to continue for a while longer. How much that while is, it could be months, it could be to the end of the year, it could be past the end of the year. We need to be prepared for that potential because we've seen that when it comes to Gaza, the Americans are really the ones in charge here, and they've placed no red lines on Israel. As long as Israel is allowed to, Israel will continue killing in Gaza. That said, I do think eventually it will end, again, because there's too many forces on all sides who do not want a bigger regional war. I also think we have to wait and see also what happens with the American elections. Because if Trump wins, it's a wild card, actually. I think Trump is likely to win. It's a wild card what will happen. He could either continue the Biden policy and keep going all in for the Israelis. He could maybe lift the red line on the whole idea of going to war on Lebanon, or he could do the opposite of all that. You really never know with Trump. It depends who he surrounds himself with and like how he feels that day. But regardless, I think we have to also recognize, historically speaking, that liberation struggles take a long time. a really long time. This is not going to end overnight, even if a ceasefire comes. I do think that I don't think that Israel is a sustainable country as an ethno-fascist state that it is, especially just given a lot of variables that I guess won't go into now, but I feel Zionism is nearing its end. However, it's not just going to finish. It's going to be a little while longer, and we have to look back at, what South Africa had to go through, what countries like Algeria. I mean, Algeria. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen in Palestine, but the French killed like 1.5 million people in 10 years before Algeria, was able to get rid of the French colonizers. So liberation takes a lot of pain, and that's just the way it works, unfortunately. So all that's to say, I don't want to like scare everybody and say, oh my God, this is going to go on forever, but I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. So yeah, fingers crossed it will. I hope it ends now. But I just don't see the Israelis being pushed into that direction at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that very, very realistic interpretation of things. And then there's a comment now from the floor, which I'll try to squeeze in before your electricity leaves you. And someone's asking, is there a sense that the imperialists are also targeting individuals who are organizing and covering the oppression? And even a person like yourself, do you have this sense of feeling unsafe? How are you managing, and how are your other colleagues working in the same area managing?
I mean, that's a great question. And I have been lucky enough so far that, I haven't been pulled aside at the airport or anything like that. But, I'm always prepared for that, because that's what it's like. I mean, everybody talks about how free the US is, but how free is it when you're constantly concerned about being interrogated because of journalistic work you're doing? And yes, my friends who are activists and who are in journalism and who are professors have absolutely been interrogated in secondary screening for the work that they're doing, whether it's just teaching about Palestine from the Palestinian perspective in their classroom on a college campus. I know people who've been interrogated over that, or whether it's leading a protest. I have friends, comrades who've been arrested in various cities across the US for being involved in protests, or if they've left and then re-entered the country, and these are American citizens I'm talking about, are pulled into secondary screening. Or, there's other ways of harassment too, like just being smeared in the media. So, I mean, yes, those are all definitely potential consequences to standing up for justice on this issue. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, because when you have a system that's so desperate to maintain its control, which it is losing right now, it is absolutely going to try to harass and intimidate those who are at the forefront of it. And there goes my electricity.
Okay. Thank you very, very much.
Now you see the results of sanctions.
Yes, yes. We thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. And I mean, it's really been a sparking and very, very, enlightening and exciting presentation, and sharing with us. We really, really thank you. And they're deep thanks coming from all parts of the internet here now. And I just share that with you. And one of the questions that people are saying is, have you any advice for organizing on the ground? What should grassroots organizations be doing? And I know your time is leaving you, but if you want to say anything at all, your final words.
Well, listen, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for all the kind words, and also for having me. It's such an honor to be able to speak at an event like this. And I think that's such an important and crucial question. I'm not an organizer myself, so I can't tell you from personal experience. What I can say is I would, people who want to get involved in this issue and organize around it, I would talk to organizations like Palestine Youth Movement, and other organizations, Palestinian-led organizations, that have the right politics, but also that are heavily involved, and are also working in collaboration with those on the ground who have our politics as well, who are, pro-liberation, anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist. These are the people we should be looking towards. So yeah, I would just get in touch with those kinds of organizations. And if you're in the US, definitely get involved. There's local chapters everywhere.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Rania. And I thank all our participants and all our listeners this evening. There's been a lot of chat, and we can't keep abreast of all of it. But let me just remind you that next week we are here again for this 25th anniversary of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And next week we're talking reparations. So next week is going to be a very interesting and exciting discussion as well. And I hope you join us. We will have Dr. Claudius Fergus, who's chair of the National Reparations Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. We'll have Dr. Marlene Atz, who's an economist at the University of the West Indies. And we'll have Ambassador David Comisiong. And they will be talking about reparations and the challenge of underdevelopment. What's the deal? So I look forward to all of you. I thank you all for listening. I thank our guest, Rania, for joining us this evening. And you can see it was midnight and on her side of the water, as we say, but she was still willing to join us at this late hour. So we thank all our listeners and look out for you next week. Let's keep the fires burning. Thank you.